Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Jonathan and Mary, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's just in the interest of time. It's already 1:06. So I believe more people will be joining us. We did have over 100 people sign up today. It looks like 25 people have made it on so far. So we have a hard stop at 2:30, so I just want to make sure we do have time to get through everything. If you haven't yet made your language selection, please do so. It was the instructions were in your email that you received yesterday, but you can just select the globe icon and choose your English or Spanish language, and then choose to mute the original audio so that you don't end up hearing two channels. All right, so without further ado, I'm just gonna go ahead and launch in. So thank you for joining us. First, we want to acknowledge that today is Juneteenth, the 19th of June, and is a holiday celebrating the end of slavery in the United States. So thank you for being with us on this important day. Let's see, we need to do some housekeeping. Hold on. All right, so just some housekeeping and things to know about. I'm Jennifer Lucas. I'm with State Council on Developmental Disabilities, and I'm listed as Charlotte in this webinar because I'm using her account because she had the account that could take more people. So thanks again for joining us today. Things to keep in mind for today's workshop. So to help us minimize distractions, please keep your microphones muted and your videos turned off. I think because we switched to webinar format, that's automatically happening. So that's good. And you can use the chat function to ask any questions you may have. Anytime during the PowerPoint, please feel free to enter your chat question and we will respond in the order they were received. After the PowerPoint presentation and Q&A is over for today, we will be sending you copies of the PowerPoint slides and any other relevant material that would make sense to send. And we'll be talking about that at the end. As I said, you have the option of listening to the presentation in either English or Spanish today, but you do have to choose the language channel that you want to select. So it's either English or Spanish, and then click mute the original audio, which just basically means that you won't hear the other language channel. You may, like I said, ask questions during the chat feature. If we're not able to get to all the questions that were asked, we are available for to answer them in a follow-up email. So just know that our contact information is one on the later slides in the PowerPoint, and you can reach out to us directly. So why are we here today? Well, we know parents are concerned about what's happening with their students' education, and they aren't the only ones. The California State Assembly met just this week to discuss that and figure out ways to reopen the public schools and what does education look like now in the fall. And they've heard from parents. They know we're concerned. So in general, we think most schools have done the best they can, just as we parents have done the best we can too. But that being said, there has been considerable variability among the different school districts and how distance learning has been implemented and what the education and services has looked like for each of our students. So this workshop is a first in a series of workshops we're offering this summer to help educate parents about their rights and about distance learning. And for today specifically, it's about focusing on data collection and tracking progress. After today's presentation, we will have 5 more workshops, once a week on Fridays, and the next one will start on July 10th. The registration information will be on one of the later slides, and people can sign up for those if you haven't already. And there'll be a similar format where we have about 45 minutes of presentation and then followed by about 45 minutes of question and answers. So if you have any questions or wish to register, please contact me after the workshop and I can help you out with that. So let's see. What is the State Council on Developmental Disabilities? Just to give a short blurb on this, we are an independent state advocacy agency established by state and federal law to advocate for the rights of people with developmental disabilities and their families, all ages, and our focus is on ensuring that people receive the services and supports they need. The office that I'm with is the Central Coast office. We serve 7 different counties that are listed on the screen, and there are also 12 other state council regional offices. I know a number of people are logging in throughout the state. So you do have a local regional office you can reach out to. The web link in the last sentence is where you can go to find your regional office's contact information. Also, each regional office has a regional advisory committee, which is made up of advocates and community members. And it's a result of our regional advisory committee that we were able to host this series of webinars over the summer. It's a collaboration between a couple of our regional advisory committee members, Jonathan and Mary, as well as a collaborative community partner, Stella.
Hey, Jennifer.
Yeah.
Can I take a minute to congratulate Jonathan on becoming chair of the Central Coast Regional Advisory Committee?
Thank you. Yes, I should have said that. Congratulations,
Thank you very much.
Jonathan. Literally just happened this morning during a meeting, so.
But there we go.
Okay, so who's presenting today? It's Mary, Jonathan, myself, and then Stella's our amazing translator, interpreter. From Monterey County. Mary Pezzo is a special education advocate in Monterey County. Jonathan Gush is a special education teacher in private practice down in Ventura County. I'm with State Council, and Stella is in Monterey County. And both Mary and Jonathan are members of our regional advisory committee. So it's been great to be collaborating with them, and we worked with Stella many times. All right, let's dive in to this. Jonathan, you're up.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to be here today. We know it's time out of your day, time away from your children, and all your other expectations. We hope to provide guidance and answer as many questions as we can. We don't have the crystal ball to see the future, and as members of the public, just like as everybody else is, we're going off all of the information sources that you are. So we do not have any special information that only we are privy to. We know everything that you as well could find access to. But the point of today's webinar is to really kind of anchor where we've been, because we have had drastic changes, and a lot of it was not part of the school district, and that's where we want to start today. The schools ended up here by public health orders, right? So we had a de facto change of placement from going to school every day, 5 days a week, to stay at home under most typically county health orders, occasionally city health orders. And the school districts had to comply with those health orders, or nothing would be where we are today. So for the vast majority of our students, education is now happening in an online setting in some variation. I know families and students that I work with have some range between online work platforms such as Google Classroom or learning platforms like Edgenuity, all the way up to directed lessons through meetings like Zoom. So we see a lot of variety, and we know that there's not one typical case moving through. So today is a lot of guidance on trying to ground us and figure out where we are now today and what we can do moving forward from today to make things better for our students. The biggest issue here is services are not being provided as they were said in the IEPs. So a lot of our students have directed services in person where the child receives the services. It's not a consultation or collaboration between staff or parents. And that's the biggest problem that we are seeing is we have these great IEPs, but no services are provided, or there is a substitution of a collaborative environment like Google Classroom pushy worksheets, but the teacher does not actually work with your child. The same is also true with accommodations. A lot of the accommodations that were developed in IEP, of course, were written for an in-person educational setting, and some of those aren't always being implemented in the virtual learning environments, which is huge because sometimes without those accommodations, children will not learn and meet their goals, right? So let's kind of talk about how are we pausing, what's working, what's not working, and figure out how we can make a change to build that bridge with the school districts when they finally reopen in the fall and they start having all these IEP meetings. How do we communicate with the schools to bridge that gap? And Jennifer, next slide, please. All right. So again, under the state, we had the executive order signed from the governor. The governor did sign an executive order funding school districts to stay open and provide educational opportunities even though students were not coming to school. That's really important because school districts run on a model where they get paid each and every day you send your child to school. So in doing this, schools can continue to be funding all the programs, including free and reduced lunch for this year and next year. The next school year budget is based off of this year's attendance rate. So all these interactions that we are having do count for something, even if it's just ADA funding or average daily attendance funding. We are faced with kind of a split here. Special education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is federal law, not state law. So while it's great that our governor is signing some executive orders, we do run into conflicts with federal legislation. And we have to take in this balance of, well, what does the state of California tell us? And what does the federal government tell us? And ultimately, if you join us through the entire series, we'll talk about, well, what happens if you need to deal with the federal government issues in federal courts rather than state courts? It's going to be different. The federal government surprisingly did not issue any waivers to special ed nor Section 504. And schools have to provide appropriate educational services even while shut down. And a lot of us don't know what that looks like because it has not happened. All right, so in a nutshell, school districts were required to provide a free and appropriate public education for students in special education while they were shut down. And we do have to kind of figure out, well, what does that mean in a distance learning model? What happened? What did not happen? All right, Jennifer, next slide, please. So the way we do this is with data collection. And data collection is supposed to be grounded in facts, things that we can observe, things that we can see, hear, and do. And it's supposed to kind of separate us from our emotions. We all love our children very much. We want to support them, get what's best. But at the end of the day, we have to figure out, where are we now? What can my child do? What can they no longer do? And what can't they do yet? So we want to be very systematic about how we go through and collect our data to communicate to the school. Now, part of being data-driven is mandated by federal law, but when we stop and think, well, what is data? It can look very different based upon whatever it is your child is doing. So it could be a little video of your child trying to read a book. What words can they read? What words do they stumble over? It could be a writing sample. It could be a picture of a drawing they made and labeled with their pictures for vocabulary. It does not have to be just number based. It could be the words that they can spell or words that they're still trying to practice. It could be writing down what time they get up in the morning, what time they go to bed, how often they work. So it can look extremely different based upon what it is you're trying to find. However, we want to be very systematic, and we'll go over different resources and links that you can go pull information from to help you with this. And at the end of the webinar, we'll email out a list of resources that you can access yourself, print out, or use online in order to help yourself facilitate data collection for your child. All right, next slide, please. So why are we doing this? Well, without really knowing where our children are, we don't know their needs. And hopefully we're facilitating lifelong learners here, but we need to figure out where our child are right now. What is their baseline? That could be anything from what books they're reading, what kind of math problems they're doing, what they can write, what they can spell, how often they talk to other people. So it also includes speech services, occupational therapy services, vocational services. All of those things have to be considered, and together, what we consider that is the present levels of performance. And what this is supposed to be is a very detailed snapshot of your child right here in the given moment. And it's very important that we do consider it to be a snapshot, because of course it will change day to day. It's supposed to be a one-time glimpse where we can look towards the future, see where your child's come, and really decide on a cohesive plan on how to move forward, right? So a lot of times when we try to write goals, we have this cute little acronym called SMART goals. It's been all the rage for about 15 years now. And the idea here is SMART helps us guide the creation of what we want children to do in terms of having specific vocabulary, right? We don't want to say a child will write something down. And it's like, well, is it their name? Is it a novel, a master's thesis? Is it scribbling on the wall? We really want to be able to be specific. No, we want this child to write a complete sentence with a capital letter or a period. We want them to fill out a graphic organizer. The more specific we're able to be, the more exact we can be in our progress tracking. And that takes us to the M, measurable. We want verbs. And speaking personally and professionally here, distance learning is very hard because it is passive, it is sitting, and it's really not what we used to do in classrooms. We want to be up and active. So making sure we have measurable verbs that we can see the kids do, hear them do, is really important. So if we have goals written like the student will know their letters, we don't have MRIs in classrooms yet to see what brain development is going on. We need to say they will read, they will say. There has to be a strong verb. The R for realistic and relevant. It should be aligned to standards. It should be aligned to help the child make progress wherever they are. And T, time limited. IDEA requires that IEP teams meet every year right now to come back and evaluate progress. And that is the key concept of where we are today. What progress was happened? What happens with all the stress that we ourselves are under and our children are under? And how does that stress affect our kids' ability to perform? And that's really where it comes down to, is what is the progress monitoring? Where are your children now? How are we going to move them forward? Okay, all right. Ready for the next slide?
I think this one's mine, isn't it?
Correct, yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. And to sort of reiterate what you said, collecting data now is so important, because you will need that when school reopens to try to get more services and supports in place for your child to help him or her recoup what they lost during the school closures. And An educational benefit is not just academic. It's not just doing well academically. It's also things like making progress in speech therapy, making progress in occupational therapy, making progress with social skills training, and making progress with, if your child's receiving mental health counseling in that area as well. An educational benefit is measured by progress. Is your child making progress, or has your child done the opposite and regressed? And if your child has regressed, then when schools reopen, you will need to request an IEP meeting to discuss that regression and to discuss putting in place additional supports and services to help your child make that ground up again. And that's when you will need the data that you have collected that shows that your child has regressed. Like if before the schools closed, if your child could, read at a second grade level, and then schools closed and then it reopens again, maybe 6-8 months later, and your child is now reading at a first grade level, you need to have that data. Like Jonathan said, you can film your child reading. You can use work samples that they've done at home. Some students have not been able to access distance learning, whether that modality just doesn't work for them or whatever the reason. And you may think that you have no data, but actually having no data is having data as well. And you can use that to show the school, look, we tried this, my child wasn't able to learn this way. How are we going to make up this ground? What's the plan? What supports and services can you offer us at this time? And you want to use that data to show that they're not meeting their IEP goals, because that's important. And data is important as well in determining what your child's present levels of performance are when the IEP goals are developed. And if you don't have a present level of performance to start from, then you don't have a baseline and you don't know where to start from, essentially. So you need to have that data. And in an appropriate education, your child will be making progress. The definition of a free, appropriate public education means that your child is making progress towards his or her IEP goals and also in the general curriculum. And there was a case in 2017, it's referred to commonly as the Andrew F. case, where the Supreme Court clarified that the school district must make an offer of a free, appropriate public education that is designed so that your student has the opportunity to make meaningful educational progress in light of his or her circumstances. And the school is obligated to draft challenging academic and or functional goals, regardless of your child's ability, and implement services that will enable your child to meet those goals. And what this means is that your child must be making more than a minimal amount of progress, that the goals must be rigorous and challenging and designed for your child to make progress. If your child is having the same goals written in his or her IEP year after year after year, your child is not receiving a free and appropriate public education. Your child should be making progress on those goals, and those goals should be changing year after year. Next slide, please, Jen. Data collection tools and resources, what to collect. You can, right now, you can certainly use your child's IEP as a starting point, go through the goals, look at the present levels of performance that are written for each goal, and see, is my child still performing at this level? If the answer is yes, then look at the goal and see what the 1 year goal is for that, and ask yourself, has my child made progress towards this goal? Because it is possible to still have the same present level of performance, but not make progress towards the goal, in which case you'll need to request an IEP meeting when school reopens, or you could even do it now, and ask the school, what else can you offer? My child's not making progress. He's still at the same baseline. He's still at the same present level of performance that he was at 6 months ago when this goal was drafted. And just ask, what else can you offer? And the answer may be nothing right now, but at least you've made that attempt. And then when school reopens, you can request another IEP meeting and ask that question again and say, what else can you offer? He needs to make progress, or she needs to make progress. And then you can also document new areas of concern and what those concerns look like, and why you have them. Like, say, for example, your child was able to read at a 5th grade level before the school closed down, and all of a sudden you're seeing regression in reading because your child's not accessing the reading programs that he or she was accessing at school. Your child doesn't have that resource time anymore. And you can document that and, just send an email to the school even, and just let them know, I have this concern and this is what's happening. And can we address this now, or do we need to wait until school reopens? And I would also consider non-academic areas as well. Things like anxiety. I've been reading about something called re-entry anxiety that a lot of people are having about things opening back up again. A lot of people are anxious and afraid to go out, even though things are reopening. Nobody knows, who's going to get sick and who's not. And it's really creating some problems for some people. And also depression in our kids. I mean, school has been out since the middle of March here, and a lot of kids are really missing their classmates. They're missing their friends, and contact the school and say, what kind of help can you offer my child for depression and anxiety right now? They can write that into the IEP and possibly offer some services via telemed with a counselor, or even when school reopens, if your child is anxious about returning to the actual physical building itself, contact the school, have an IEP meeting, and just let them know, my child has a lot of anxiety. Can we get some counseling services in place to address this? But again, you'll need data for that. So start taking that data now. If your child is coming to you and saying, I don't want to go back to school, I'm afraid I'm going to get sick, things of that nature, write it down, keep a log of it. And then you can use that when school reopens to help get your child help. And then how to collect data. You can ask the district in writing for the data collection methods that they use, and ask them to describe to you what those methods are. And if appropriate, you can use those methods yourself. And you can work collaboratively with your child's teachers if your child's not handing in work or things like that. Then you can ask the teachers to let you know what the rate and frequency is that your child is handing in work without being prompted at home. And if needed, you can ask for training, but you'll need to ask for this in writing, on how to measure and monitor and interpret data. This could be a related service. And there's also a link there for online sources for how to collect data as well that you can look up on the internet. And you definitely want to compare the data that you're taking to what the goal baselines are that are written in your child's IEPs. Sometimes they're called baselines, sometimes they're called present levels of performance. They're both the same thing. They're kind of interchangeable terms. So look for those. They're in every single IEP for every single goal. And then you can look at the benchmarks if your child has any in his or her IEP, and see what those are. I mean, even if your child meets the first benchmark and stagnates there and stops and makes no further progress for the rest of the year, then that's not really progress. And your child probably won't meet the year-end goal if he or she has met one benchmark but can't do the rest of whatever is required to meet that goal. So pay attention to that as well. And then also you can look at the data that you collect and even that the school collects, and you can look for trends and patterns. Like say your child was really off task for a few days. Well, was your child sleeping well the night before? Is your child eating? You can look for things like that, or things like your child was expected to write a paragraph independently, and you got maybe one sentence out of your child with multiple prompts. That's data. Keep track of how many times did you have to prompt your child to get that sentence written? How long did it take? Things like that. Next slide. Make sure to find a system that works for you when it comes to being organized and keeping your child's work and your child's IEP records organized. A lot of parents like to maintain a binder, a 3-ring binder, because documents don't fall out of 3-ring binders quite as much. And you can keep all of the IEP documents and assessments in the binder, organize them. When I make binders, I like to do them in chronological order with the oldest IEP and assessments and on top, starting from there, and then going back. So when you look at the binder, it's kind of like reading a book, and it tells a story. It tells the story of your child and your child's learning needs, and hopefully progress as well. And there's a link there for understood.org for tips and a video on creating your own special education binder, including some binder checklists, which come in handy as well. It's definitely good to keep all of the copies of the IEPs that the school gives to you. If they don't give you a copy of the signed IEP, you need to ask for one, because that's like a contract, and the school is held accountable for what is in that IEP and that contract. And definitely, make a binder, keep it organized. And definitely save their schoolwork and classwork as well. I like to save that separate from the binder, just by year, again, in chronological order, because that's data, and that shows what your child has learned or not. And then consider as well that your child may want to collect his or own data if appropriate. And they can do a self-rating scale on how they're feeling, and maybe have them keep a journal throughout all of this. And another option to automate is to automate this with Google Forms. It's fairly simple to go on Google Forms and just make up your own templates for forms that you can just print out and use, and keep those in the binder as well. Next slide. And how does the data factor into the IEP process? I think I kind of already answered this, but I'll go over it again. Data is used and helps the IEP team in identifying your child's needs and determining the progress or regression that your child has made. And data also shows, or also helps in the process of writing IEP goals. It helps give you that baseline and that present level of performance. Data determines the supports and services that your child needs, like speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, things like that. And that data is usually derived through assessments that is usually done by the therapist. Data also comes into play in placement decisions. If your child is capable of doing grade level work in a general education class, data will show that, and that's where your child should be placed. And data is very important in determining if your child is receiving a free and appropriate public education. because data will show progress or lack of progress. Next slide.
That is me. All right, so what is compensatory education? I'm sure most of you guys have been hearing that term tossed around. And it's important to know what it is and what it means for the current circumstances right now with COVID and school closures and all of that. So in a nutshell, it's basically a remedy to make up for the free and appropriate public education not being provided. So the services that are in the IEP, those supports that are in there, generally haven't been provided to the same extent nearly enough over distance learning time. And so naturally, compensatory education has been discussed, and the U.S. Department of Ed did issue guidance around that as well, I think back in March. But one thing to know about compensatory education is that it is not in federal or state regulations. It's not guaranteed. It's not in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So there's nothing that's guaranteed in law for it. It basically came about in court law, court decisions starting in the 1980s. And it is very individually based. So very much depends on that student's specific circumstances and needs. And to that end, it also is not necessarily hour for hour. So if your student missed 30 hours of speech therapy due to distance learning, that does not necessarily equate to 30 hours of speech therapy when school resumes. It really just depends on the individual student. So the Department of Ed had issued the guidance basically stating that, let's see, what does it say? That they understand that if students don't receive services for an extended period of time, which is often what's happened for most of our kiddos, that the IEP team or the appropriate personnel, if your student has a 504 plan, must make the individualized determination as to whether and to what extent services are needed, compensatory services are needed to make up for any skills that may have been lost. So the key takeaways from that guidance are that it's an individualized determination because every student has different needs. The IEP team will determine if the services are necessary, or if your student has a 504 plan, it would be the appropriate personnel at the school. And it's all about making up for lost skills or regression. And many students, as a parent, you should keep your focus on your individual students' needs, but it's also important to see the big picture too. And the big picture is that all students were impacted. And a lot of students' learning has been lost during this time when people are receiving distance learning, not just students in special education. So many students, whether in special ed or not, will be coming back in the fall with some significant deficits from this past school year. And just how much students have regressed is a bit unclear, but each district will have to develop and figure out ways to address this. And we'll get into this in a little bit too. So of course you're asking yourself, does your particular student need compensatory education? How would you determine that? And these are some of the questions that you would want to ask yourself. Were IEP services not provided due to distance learning? So a lot of us had services that were in our child's IEP that just did a hard stop during distance learning. So you would answer yes to that question, right? If your student had a one-to-one academic tutor or support prior to COVID, and if that stopped during the distance learning, then your answer is yes to that first question. What if you had some IEP services provided over distance learning, but they didn't end up meeting your students' needs? I'm thinking in the case of, Mary brought the case up of a child with anxiety. So perhaps they were receiving counseling services prior to the school closures that were effective, and then the school closures happen, and perhaps those counseling services move to online, but for any variety of reasons, those online services weren't effective, then your answer is yes to this, and that's a reason to consider compensatory services. Student regression, obviously, is huge. So that's kind of like the big thing to be looking for, and that's what Mary was discussing with the data and collecting the data and, you know, basically documenting if your students regressed. You know, it's important. I mean, parent opinion's critical, but data talks. So it's really important to try to capture what that regression looks like and keep some data in about that. And what sources of information can be used as data, right? We talked about that too. It can be all sorts of things. It can be a video. It can be a student self-rating scale. It could be, you know, tracking in a data log about, you know, how many times there's resistance or behavior issues. You know, it just depends on your individual student's needs. And then really looking to see what that data says. So I'm going to jump ahead a couple slides. I think I did these out of order, but Mary developed a great tracking template. And for those of you who registered, I had emailed you a copy of that tracking template. So hopefully you have that for your reference too. But Mary, I'm just going to skip ahead a couple slides so you can, oh, it's just this slide, good. So you can kind of explain some of this tracking template.
Okay. Let me make this bigger here. There we go. So on the first page, you know, you can write down your student's name and school in the district, and then you can use that for writing in what your student should have been getting and what they actually got during the COVID-19 shutdown to keep track of the IEP minutes that were missed. The second page is just a calendar of days so that you can mark school days and the days that they were supposed to get the services. And then the third page, can't see that very well. Okay, that's the page that you can document the services that were provided during the shutdown. And then the fourth page, I think, is the contact log with the school, like when you emailed or called or spoke with the school and the areas that you were concerned about, and let them know that you were concerned about. You can document it on that page. So you've got it all right there, and you can make multiple copies as needed. And it's just kind of a tracking tool to keep track of minutes that were served, minutes that were not served, and when you contacted the school and let them know, you know, what was working or what wasn't working.
Thanks, Mary.
Sure.
So basically, in addition to the data that you collect and summarize, this information about answering these questions, that's what's going to help you determine and clarify what services your student may need to compensate for the missed services and regression. So as I said before, what compensatory services or education looks like for one student can look totally different for another student. The individual circumstances matter. So a student transitioning out of high school may have one type of needs and may need a certain type of compensatory services and certain hours. And another younger student may have completely different needs. And so I know in court law, in court cases, that it's ranged all over the place for what students end up getting. And it's also important to note that compensatory education, as we saw from the guidance, hopefully will be a determination of the IEP team, and you won't have to go to due process around it. But that being said, it's important for parents to know their rights. And I think Jonathan mentioned our last workshop later this summer is all about when you have disputes with the school and what your due process rights are. Okay. So advocacy tips. Number one thing, don't lead with emotion. Lead with common sense. So you want to be respectful. And the best way to avoid special education due process is really just to assume it's going to happen and prepare for it. And preparing for it means that you're a collaborative team member, that you've documented your concerns, and that you're shown that you're a reasonable parent that's acting in the best interest of your student. So what is it going to take to get your student back up to speed? You want to compare the data before COVID with the data now, and that's what Mary was talking about. And there's a number of ways to do that. Was there a significant regression? Was there just a little, right? These are all things that would kind of go into your advocacy strategy. And then document, document, document. So there's a saying that if it wasn't in writing, then it didn't happen. And you know, as much as we all love having phone calls and face-to-face discussions with folks, not so much face-to-face anymore, but you know, alternative means of communicating, if those weren't written down or captured in writing some way, then it really doesn't count. And so this is one of those advocacy strategies that parents will often utilize. So even if you have a phone call, for instance, with a teacher or someone with school, and there's, you know, some key content that was discussed, you don't have any way to record it, right? Because it's a phone call. But what you can do is then summarize that phone call in an email to the teacher, you know, in a very nice, polite thank you email. Thank you for talking with me about Johnny and, you know, his different needs and the fact that he's really struggling with his anxiety still, and that the school's not able to provide anything. It's that kind of thing that you're wanting to document. And it says letter to a stranger up here on the third bullet point. And what that basically means is that whatever you document, whatever you write up, whatever letters you write up to the school, you want to imagine that a stranger who doesn't know you or the school happens across that letter, reads that letter, and takes away from that letter that you were clearly, logically, and politely making your point, and that your position made sense. So they wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't want a stranger picking up the letter and thinking that, you know, this parent is really angry and finger pointing and blaming all these things, because that doesn't demonstrate that you're reasonable, and it doesn't create the best paper trail. So really, polite documentation is a very good way to create a positive, solid paper trail to help you should you end up going to due process. Because it is important for us parents to know that parents often lose their case in due process just because of their demeanor, which is kind of shocking. But so it's not always just about the facts. So you just want to keep it respectful, keep it classy. So if a school says they have no ability and no money to do anything at all, are you going to be upset with that response? Yeah, I would. Are you going to get angry and start finger pointing? Nope. You may want to, but no, not a good strategy. You would send a nice letter thanking them for clarifying their points, that they don't have enough money to provide whatever XYZ service it was, and that you will continue to do your best in advocating for your students' needs and to address any regression. And by doing that, then you've documented you're the polite, reasonable person, and you've also documented exactly what the school's told you. So there it is in writing. And at the end of all that, you still have your rights as parents to file a complaint or ask for a special ed due process hearing. As I said, we'll be covering that later in the summer, July 31st workshop, actually. It's important to know that everything should be documented. So when you look at your IEPs, a lot of us communicate through IEPs, which is great because that's a form of documentation, but be organized. So documentation is one thing, but make sure and stay organized, and, you know, maybe create a subfolder in your IEP, you know, platform to have all your correspondence with the school about, you know, Johnny or Beth or whoever the students are, right? A subfolder for each one about the correspondence. So that way, when things come up, you can easily access that. It helps you become better prepared, and it helps increase your knowledge. And the more knowledgeable you are, the more effective your advocacy is going to be for your child. And the last thing I want to mention about advocacy and this actually came up earlier this morning with another parent who had reminded me, there's other types of advocacy besides just about your specific student. There's the larger advocacy about your school district. Right now, school districts, many school districts, including mine, have actually solicited parent feedback, right? They want to hear from parents to get their feedback about, how to do the reentry, what services are still needed, what was your experience like in distance learning? And so fill out those surveys if they ask, send out surveys to you. Make sure and give your input. Secondly, the school board meetings, right? They're happening right now. In a way, they're more accessible now than ever because they're virtual. So you can go ahead and participate and type in your question and, get your needs addressed by the school board. And that way it's more not just about your student, but about what the school's offering in general and how they're going to address the needs of special education students coming back in the fall. The parent who I spoke with this morning, Jonathan and Mary heard as well, had, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this, I'm not gonna give her name, but she had said, one of the key things about getting kind of parent grassroots efforts going is actually connecting with the other parents in the community. So how do you do that? How do you know the other parents that have children with IEPs in your school district? It's not always easy to find out, right? The school district doesn't just hand you a list saying, oh, here's all the contact information. So she would actually stand outside the parking lot waiting outside certain special day classes or whatnot to try to connect with parents and try to encourage and grow a grassroots advocacy campaign. And she's succeeding. And so I think that's a great strategy because the more parents can band together and create their own parent group, the bigger voice they have. That's a bigger platform you can stand on and then present information to the board about what you think, how you think the rights of children with special ed and special education need to be respected, or what changes need to be made, and any suggestions you guys may have. So on that line, I want to make sure to touch on this, but I'm going to be sending out an email to everyone who participated today and attended, and even those who haven't logged in, just basically finding out if they're interested in having their email shared with other people in other parents of special needs children in their district. So I'll be asking about like what school district your child goes to, probably a little survey, and then if you want to opt into some sort of email collaboration, so you can get connected with those other parents and really start figuring out, what's going on with our school district. Because remember, every school district is totally different in how they're operating and how it's all going to roll out in the fall. So you really have to address things at a local level. And it does help to have kind of that advocacy grassroots group with the parents. All right. And so, we start the process when the new school year ends, right? I mean, the new school year resumes. You find your district's 2021 academic calendar for the first day. You're going to send a written request most likely, and of course email is fine, requesting an IEP meeting to address any and all concerns. We'll get more into the IEP process in the next couple workshops and dive in deeper, but you don't need to surprise the IEP team with what you're going to discuss. It's good for parents to actually create their own agenda and share that with the IEP team. But there's been no waivers in California on when the IEP team will be held. So they still have 30 days once you give your notice that you're requesting that meeting. And let's see. This is the upcoming workshops the rest of the summer that we're offering. Like I said, it is a similar format as to now, where we cover kind of a little PowerPoint presentation for the first part. I'm going over time a little now. And then we delve into the question and answers. So you guys will all have copies of this sent to you after the presentation, along with some other stuff. We have all our contact information here, emails and phone numbers, if you would like to follow up with any one of us with additional questions or concerns. And so right now we're going to open it up to your questions and address them in the order they were received. Some of you sent in questions prior that if we haven't yet addressed them from our little talk right now, and they're relevant to today's workshop, we're going to go ahead and read those and respond to those first. And then any questions that have been appearing in the chat box, we will take those on a first come, first served basis. And Mary and Jonathan, you guys can take over. I'm going to launch a 5-question poll, a very brief poll just to get your feedback. So you'll see the poll pop up on your screen, and it's just yes or no answers. So a quick little poll to give us feedback on how we're doing and what you thought of the presentation. And then Mary and Jonathan are going to start diving into some of the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So one of the questions we got before the meeting started was regarding progress to goals, and where there is a boundary line that would qualify a student for compensatory education. And there is really no set guideline to when and where a student would be eligible for compensatory ed. However, progress is the key word here. If you're noticing that there is next to no progress or regression, then we do need to take action to figure out what needs to change in order to bring progress to a forward mark. And hopefully this is noticed. You do not have to wait to an annual IEP to actually bring this concern up. You are eligible to request an IEP whenever you'd like, and the school district needs to have one within 30 days of your written request. So do put that in the letter, do put that in writing to bring up the concerns about progress. And if there is continually no progress, there's continually no changes made, then yes, that is a conversation that you could have about compensatory education. We also have gotten a couple questions about one-on-one aides or paraprofessionals. Every school district tends to have a different acronym for them. When I was working down south, Los Angeles Unified called it AAA for additional adult assistance. My mother worked as a SESA, special education support aide. But nonetheless, they are the extra adult support provided to a student to make progress. And generally, school districts cannot force their staff to go into a child's home. That's for a number of different reasons. And of course, now during COVID, it may not be prudent to send staff members out. However, we don't even necessarily know what all those paraprofessionals are doing if they're still on the payroll. I hope they're not all laid off, but they're probably available. But that brings the question to what type of services were they performing? Paraprofessionals should have a specific IEP goal if they're included as a service to manage progress. So sometimes it's to facilitate mainstreaming, sometimes it's health reasons, sometimes it's behavioral supports. And especially if it's the behavioral supports, you do want to look in and see what your child is or is not doing in terms of accessing their education. If there is a need for one-on-one directed instruction, then yes, that would be part of the whole educational benefit side of the equation. If your child does need that one-on-one support to access education, the district should be providing it. I also had another question come in earlier before the webinar started about community-based instruction in academics. So these are for our older students, typically in high school on a transition plan, and looking at the need for access to CBI, community-based instruction, and academics. And if you are seeing concerns that are not being addressed, there does need to be an IEP goal written in every area of need. So if there's a writing goal, there should be writing instruction. If your child is having difficulty reading, there should be a reading goal. However, at the transition age, you might start to see more functional reading goals. It could be reading street signs, names of the streets in the neighborhood. Those would kind of double dip, so to speak, of reading and transition services. But if you are seeing regression and other goals need to be written, or you need extra services to help your child meet those goals, do talk, do reach out, and have these tough conversations here. Within the same question, there was also a comment about 3 years have gone by, and that would be a need for a triennial reassessment as well to make sure your child is still eligible for special education and redetermine present levels of performance with standardized assessments. Mary, do you have a couple questions?
I do. I have one here that was submitted before the webinar. What are the rights of children with disabilities if they're not able to return to school due to high risk of COVID infection? From what I'm hearing, I think a lot of schools are going to give parents options of either continuing to do distance learning virtually or going to school in person for either part days or going every other day, but going on a more limited school schedule than what we normally see occurring. If the district is not allowing parents that option to continue with distance learning, what parents could do is, if their child has a weakened immune system or they are in the high risk category of getting a COVID infection or getting a secondary infection from that, they can get a note from their doctor and go on what's called home and hospital instruction, and address it that way. And then another question with that was, how can high school students be included and get transition and vocational related services? With that, it depends on what the student's transition plan is. And I think, you know, you're going to have to get creative on what that's going to look like via distance learning, or even once things reopen and we still have to wear masks and do social distancing. It depends on what vocational related services they were receiving. They, you know, hopefully the vocational teachers and people who design those programs are trying to implement those programs as much as they can right now. But again, when things reopen, if nothing's been done with regards to those, parents should be asking for compensatory services to address the time that was lost in delivering those services. And another question that came through was, what can you do if the school is non-compliant with your child's IEP? During the school closure, I think most schools are non-compliant with what was written in your child's IEP before COVID-19. And during this time, schools are obligated to implement the IEP as much as they possibly can. And I think most districts are trying to do that. But again, you need to get the data on regression, on lack of progress, and address that when schools reopen to get more services in place to where your child is making progress again. If it's a flat out case of they're not providing anything, but they're providing online teaching to the general education students, you can do what is called filing a compliance complaint with the California Department of Education. Districts are obligated to try to continue to implement IEPs as much as they possibly can under the circumstances, if they are providing an education to the general ed students. So the short answer is a compliance complaint, but you've got to keep in mind that Governor Newsom waived the timelines to complete assessments. Those are pretty much on hold until things reopen, which they are starting to reopen. And I do know of some private assessors who have done some assessments during the closure. They were deemed essentially necessary. That was deemed an essentially necessary service. So that's waived. If you are needing to have an IEP and assessments are done and everything else is done, then the district should be conducting that IEP meeting online via Zoom or Google Hangout or whatever means they want to use, but they should be still conducting IEP meetings. If they're not, file a compliance complaint. Make that request for the IEP meeting in writing via email and attach that as your documentation and proof that you requested the meeting. And I think there was one other question here. Is it possible for a student to repeat the school year because my student is being academically affected due to COVID? It is possible. I know districts don't typically have students with IEPs repeat a school year, because if they do that, that's admitting that they didn't receive a free and appropriate public education, because if that child had made progress, then they wouldn't be repeating the school year. But for some students, that is a good choice. It just depends on the student, and it is possible for them to do it. But you're going to have to convince them that that is the only option for your child. If they dig their heels in and they absolutely won't let your child repeat the year, then have the conversation with them about, well, what other services and supports are you going to provide my child with so that my child is functioning at that next grade level at the end of next year? And I think that's all I have.
Okay, I think I'll take a couple quick ones that we also got prior, but then we can jump in because there's a lot in the chat box. So maybe Mary and Jonathan, you can go back. I think they start at 1:27, the timestamp. But one of the questions we got was, what will happen for ESY? Will there be regular classes, or will be online learning too? And from everything I've heard, you're looking at online learning. I haven't heard of any particular districts doing regular in-person classes, but that doesn't mean that's not a possibility, I suppose, if they're able to like just do everything correctly and with the mask and the distance and everything, and they have it all lined up. So I would just check with your local district to make sure what their plan is. And what I have heard with online learning with some districts is that they're actually offering a much greater variety of options for online learning for students to take. So that's a positive. Another question was that with distance learning, the school district was only offering a small fraction of my students' service hours, and how can she get more service hours? So this is one of those things we've all kind of dealt with, that she's tried communicating with the special education teacher, but had no luck. So it's important that just to know that obviously services that were listed on the regular IEP generally were not provided during the distance learning in the most part. And they weren't reduced or stopped because your student no longer needs them. So that's important to keep in mind too, right? So nothing changed in your student's needs to warrant that drop in service. So the best thing for the parent to do is come back in writing, and you can start writing now, right? Sending emails to the district, and then following up again when school resumes on what you wrote, but basically stating, hey, these are my student's needs. He still has them. In fact, now he has X, Y, and Z needs too as a result of the distance learning and not receiving those services. And what's the plan? And how are you going to be providing these extra services? And what about compensatory services, right? You don't have to put the compensatory services aspect into the letter, but I think the letter should address exactly what your students' needs are, how they've changed, and you're expecting that the IEP would be fully implemented immediately upon the school year resuming. And then also, of course, requesting an IEP meeting to occur to address how to potentially make up for that lost time, and any new needs that may have arisen too. Those were a couple questions I saw. Do you, Jonathan, Mary, did you guys go look through the chat box?
I'm seeing a couple good questions about how to file a complaint with the California Department of Education. I've gone ahead and pasted that link into the chat box for everybody. Just a little kind of word of advice. We need to be patient here. I've also received a letter from the California Office of Administrative Hearings that the entire system is being overwhelmed right now. And I think part of where we are at is let's try and start with what's under our local control and really working with the school districts. I know it's hard to hear that right now, but if you can get more immediate action taken now, especially with, I should say now when the schools reopen, that's probably going to be better in the long run. Otherwise, we're going to have to wait until this gets to federal court, which, you know, even here in Ventura County, that's LA County Superior Federal Court. And that has about a 1 to 2 year wait list to have your case heard, not even decided. So definitely do work with your school. I think they're going to be willing to work with parents a little bit more. I hope we can resolve a lot of this together. The other part here is home hospital teaching. And I personally, professionally, it's a double-edged sword. Typically, you do want to have a doctor's note to document the condition. In this case, you know, if we're talking about a student going outside, you might want to talk to your primary care physician about agoraphobia, have a psychologist possibly look at that as well. But it's not an end-all solution. Home hospital teaching is the most restrictive placement, and moving off of it is extremely difficult. We do want to make sure you have access to all the services you need, including social emotional services, behavioral goals, collaboration from school staff and outside agencies on an IEP to really make a good plan forward of how your child will come off of it, because we don't want to see students there unless it's absolutely needed. And working with school districts for an appropriate placement during distance learning needs to happen as well. And virtual learning is not the same thing as home hospital teaching.
Right, and home hospital teaching only guarantees you 5 hours of direct teaching a week. It's not a full school day. The teacher comes to your house usually, although in a case with a student at risk of getting sick, they might do it virtually, but it would be 5 hours a week.
I mean, it sounds like most schools are going to be doing some version of hybrid schooling in the fall, right? So your child's not going to be sitting in a classroom packed with kids, you know, 5 days a week. That's just, yeah.
I'm hearing that that some districts are going to split the students into 2 groups and have them alternate coming to school so that it's a much smaller class size, and that they will be able to social distance and that they will be wearing masks and washing their hands.
As long as one of those groups isn't all special education students, then it's, you know, it's manageable probably. But we don't want to segregate one group and say, oh, only these kiddos are going at this time, because you're still wanting full integration.
Right.
Yeah. Did you guys see another question? There were a lot. It looks like, Jonathan, you answered quite a number. I was trying to go through.
Yes, I try to get a lot going.
Thank you.
You know, and again, everyone, it's not too late to start conversations with the school. There is a 2-year statute of limitations. Typically for parents to bring complaints against the school district, unless there's some extenuating circumstances. So a lot of that has to deal with, you know, do parents know their rights? Do they know that this should have been a problem? And given all the chaos in the world right now, I would say that a judge would probably waive that 2-year statute of limitations. But of course, you're here with us now. Thank you. You guys are being more informed to take this action. So I would reach out as soon as possible. what this looks like is as soon as the student calendar starts, whenever that is, many districts start late August now, some after Labor Day, put a written request in for an IEP, and your IEP team will have to convene within 30 days of the start of school. Begin that conversation, talk about what plans are in place. Right now, again, there is a lot of uncertainty still. Government agencies move slowly. Many of the school districts here in Ventura County are having their school boards meet this week or next week to talk about options. A couple are also ahead of that and having their school boards vote on different considerations as well. And as Mary mentioned, there is this possibility for tracking of how to break students apart. That's going to be a huge issue for mainstreaming as well. So do keep a close eye on your school districts, send in comments and concerns to make sure your opinion is heard in these matters.
Then I'd like to address one last question if I can. Somebody asked, what is the best way to ask for frequent correspondence from my students and instructors, being that my son is mostly nonverbal and cannot update me on his day or week? Some parents, especially in elementary school, they have a notebook that goes back and forth between home and school. But email is also a good way. If you can get the teacher to email you at the end of every day or the beginning of every day on what they worked on, what they did, how his mood was, or even the aide, if he has an aide or there's an aide in the classroom, that's a good way to get it done as well.
Yeah, that's good. Did we answer Amber's? I saw there was at 2:01. She said my question is not answered. My son's triennial was scheduled, but the school closures happened due to COVID. Our IEP team was supposed to resume, but it never did. I moved my children's schools due to so many problems with services at the former school. And then she contacted the special ed director or case manager of the school and the district office and still have not received an IEP date. And my son's services were never given. And she was told they can't offer speech or OT on Zoom. So that does vary by school district. That last part, right, Mary?
What was that?
That last part does vary by school district, where some districts do offer speech and OT of some sort virtually.
The ones that don't offer it virtually, they can contract out with a private provider who does do it virtually. Because I know that we've got some here in Monterey that that are doing it virtually, that are private providers that the district is contracting with to continue that service for the student.
And if a parent had the means to fund, which I know I wouldn't, but if a parent had the means to fund private OT or PT themselves or whatever speech the child needs, I do know that it's very wise to give the district a 10-day written notice, letting them know that you plan on purchasing those services because the district's not providing them, even though they're in the IEP.
You have to give them 10 days notice or they are not obligated to reimburse you.
Right.
10 days written notice.
Yeah. And so the other part of Amber's chat was just, it sounded like poor communication and no IEP date. So again, ensuring everything's in writing, because when you request an IEP, and of course, IEPs aren't going to be held over it's a summer break. I mean, so legally, they're not entitled to be held over the summer break.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if her child needs extended school year services, then if she hasn't requested the meeting in writing yet, she definitely needs to start emailing people.
Right.
Getting that documentation. And if they're just completely non-responsive, file a compliance complaint.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the remedy to the complaint is having the IEP meeting. So,
yeah.
The other part of that question was about changing schools, and districts are entitled to do their own assessments as well. They do not have to accept another school district's own results. Different schools have different policies. Sometimes they will accept assessment results from another school in the same SELPA, or special education local plan area. So here in Ventura County, our entire county belongs to one SELPA, just like Santa Barbara County. I don't know across the state, and typically even like the more populous counties like Los Angeles and Orange County have multiple SELPAs. So part of that issue is communicating with the new school district. There's record releases that have to go on. So do keep on top of that as well.
Yeah, and I was thinking, somebody mentioned about the virtual speech and OT, can't versus won't, and I agree. And that's where one of those things with parent advocacy comes in handy. Like if you have other parents that you can network with and kind of create a little grassroots parent group to come and present information to the board and push the district to offer this, because it's not the last time, right? So we know that there's a lot of uncertainty in the next school year. We know that there's a chance of additional school closures for certain amounts of time, right? If another student ends up being exposed, or a staff, to COVID, I don't know what that looks like for the school, but I do know that these services need to be available. Some services can be very effective online, and the district needs a shove from the parent community if they're being resistive to offering that.
Yeah.
And I see a good question. Oh, sorry, Mary.
And if they're completely resistant to it, then ask them in an email how and when they plan to provide compensatory services for that.
Right. And I see a good question to end on, or actually the two good questions to end on from Gladys and
3 minutes
Joyce.
left. Okay.
And the question is, are policies legal? And no, they are not. School district policies, even if they are voted on by the school board, need to comply with state and federal laws. As we are here discussing special education, we are talking about federal law, and the IDEA was left very generic because the intent was local IEP teams, meaning the ones you go to as your child's parent and educational advocate, are supposed to make the decisions that are best for your child. It starts there. So as we are trying to see school districts write some sort of false equivalency, well, if your child goes to the resource room for 5 hours a week, they get 1 hour of time with the teacher. There's no such policy written in stone. It is the school district trying to do whatever they can in the moment, and it's not always the right thing to do. So as you go forward, do know that it's local at an IEP meeting. School districts do need to provide educational benefit. They do need to provide a free and appropriate public education, and it starts with you as the parent letting the district know that's not happening.
Right.
And if they do tell you, if they do tell you that there's a policy that states some particular thing that negates what you're asking for, ask them for a copy of that policy.
Absolutely. Yeah, you want the documentation of whatever they're saying to back it up, so you have something to work with.
Yep.
The very last question I saw, at least, was in Spanish, and I think if Google Translate is working well, it says, is the district required to provide appropriate education to students, or they just try to provide the best they can? And so that was basically what, the gist of this past distance learning period of time was. It was the, providing FAPE to the best of their abilities. So it's a little bit vague, but that was it was new and novel then. But now as we're moving toward the summer, heading toward the new school year, a lot of those questions and issues that came up and the feedback they've undoubtedly received need to be incorporated to ensure that students are provided with FAPE. That is their entitlement this school year. So schools have had time to start planning. They're spending the time this summer planning on how to reopen and address students' needs. And that's what our series of workshops is kind of working toward. What's happened already has happened, but what can parents start doing right now? And then moving forward to the school year starting. So Mary, Jonathan, you guys have any other last minute things you want to share?
I just want to thank everybody for joining us today.
Yes, the same here for me. I think we got to a lot of the questions. We
I
did
know
get a
there's
lot
another
of
one that
people-
came in. Oh my gosh,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, you guys, I don't know how best to answer these questions. I think we might maybe address some of them in a document and then send them out to everyone with the answers.
Yes, and there were many more questions asked on the Google form, and we've tried to stay focused today on the ones that pertain to data collection, but we did get excellent questions. And the rest of our webinars are designed to, as you would progress through an IEP meeting, because there is a definite reason why IEPs are laid out in the way that they are. So thank you for being patient with us. We do have a plan to talk about all these great parts for you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good weekend too.